as I'm playing with my 1960s Timpo Cowboys, I began to remember ideas I'd had from being young. It made me think about how perhaps characterization of wargaming figures role play came about right from the very beginning, even though we didn't call it characterization. So the very first thing we used to do was simply play out the episode we've just watched. So let's go on. We'll stay with the cowboy theme. I used to like Rawhide, and before I did what I'm about to tell you I did, I couldn't have told you why. All I could tell you was I liked Rawhide. Couldn't really remember much about it, except that we used to watch Rawhide, and we used to play games based on the episodes. Well, I went back on YouTube recently, as in this morning, and I've just watched an episode of Rawhide, 1964. It was interesting. It wasn't anything like I imagined, but it made me think of several things. One, in the one I watched, there wasn't a lot of fighting type action. There was some fighting, but most of it was interaction between characters. Clint Eastwood's Rowdy Yates character spent a lot of time taking his guns off and going to try and negotiate peaceful settlements around the dispute they were having, which was trying to take some cattle over a river, and two warring cattle barons who were trying to stop each other. And he didn't want to get involved, but he'd been tricked to get involved. But what we'd do, we'd watch the episode, and then we'd go out with our cowboy hats on, and we'd play what we'd been watching. And whoever was boss of the group would be Rowdy Yates, and I'd end up being cowboy number 3 or another, maybe the cook, strange little wizened cook they had. But there were things that happened in that episode, and I didn't watch any others, but explained quite a bit of what happened to my gaming during the later 60s. So this was 63, 64, Series 3 it was anyway. But in 1965, 100th anniversary of the American Civil War, a kid appeared at school, and he appeared at school with the greatest bubblegum cards I thought I'd ever seen in my life. I remember I'm a small boy, so I've only got small hands, but to me they were huge. They weren't like cigarette cards, these were huge. And the scenes on them were, for me at the time, incredibly realistic battle scenes with blood and gore and people on fire. But you also got a big piece of bubble gum as big as a card, and you got some Confederate dollars, and everybody was walking around school with piles, big handfuls of Confederate dollars, and big huge piles of these cards that we traded and swapped. And I don't even remember when. It might have started before the end of the Civil War. It might have started any time in the 1960s. It certainly happened at primary school. So that was one exposure to the American Civil War. But having watched Rawhide, there were a lot of references in Rawhide to American Civil War commanders. And in that episode I watched, especially Confederate ones, they were trying to think of a plan to outwit the bad cattle baron. And one of the men in Rowdy Yates's gang, Clint Eastwood's gang, had ridden with Jeb Stewart, and another one had ridden with Nathan Bedford Forrest, names that I wasn't familiar with. But there's another chap who fought with Sherman going to Atlanta, and one of the cattle barons was a Confederate major, and one of them had been a Union soldier in a Confederate Civil War prisoner of war camp. I hadn't remembered that. There was also quite a dramatic scene, I thought, for the 60s of a man being hung, lynched. And you didn't actually see him being lynched, but you saw his screams and pleading before it happened, and you saw the shadow of his hanging body from the tree just before Clint Eastwood cut it down. And it certainly isn't a children's programme. And it's as good as any Western that I'd ever seen. I used to go into the public library in the village where I lived every week with my mum, and we'd pick a book and we'd sign it out and we'd have it for a week. And I had, for week after week after week, a book called, I want to call it Johnny Reb. I think it was called Johnny Reb. And the cover was a Confederate soldier hiding in some rocks. I never read it. It was far too old for me. I was about 8, 7. It was the cover that held my attention. And I asked my dad and people around my granddad about the American Civil War. My grandma knitted me a grey jumper and I got some red sergeant stripes, British ones, that my grandma sewed on. And I think I like you've got to remember, this is naivety and not knowing. I like the Confederates because I'd only ever seen American cavalry Union Custer type soldiers in blue, or to be honest, before colour, black and white. But I thought that was interesting. I also, at the same time, bought a Britain's Confederate bugler. If he'd been a Union bugler, I would have still bought him. I bought him because he was beautiful. And I've never seen a figure like him. And I've looked on eBay, I've gone through the catalogues. I can't find him anywhere. And it was in a sort of, he had a rifle over his shoulder and he was blowing his bugle. And he had a pale blue cap, like a kepi. But his rucksack and backpack and the sleeping roll came off. They were loose. They were on straps, and you could get them off. And his cross belts were, and they weren't part of the model. They were loose. You could get them off. He was gorgeous. I remember lying in bed at bedtime, just looking at him, and I had him on a shelf next to my bed. So originally we just played the episode we'd watched, no character there. But over time our games became more characterful. Sunday afternoon we'd watch maybe Bonanza, High Chaparral. And a friend of my brother's had the Timpo Ranch, which was big. That was expensive big, we didn't have it. We had a few soldiers. But once we got a ranch, we could then have a scene set around the ranch, and suddenly we weren't playing the episode we've watched because we were playing it while the episode was on. It was an inspiration, really. And we started to make things happen that weren't happening on the television. And we brought in characters from our other figures, like bank robbers, and we played out scenes that weren't on the television. I mean, back in those days, I'm talking about 63 to 66. This was long before I knew about wargaming, certainly before role-playing was a thing. We used to shoot our figures by having an elastic band. We'd hold it between finger and thumb, and you'd get a little card pellet, bit of card folded over, pull it back, and a bit like the H.G. Wells' Little Wars idea, you'd put it over the man who was having a shot, and you'd have a shot. If you knocked the man over, he was shot. And you'd hide behind the buildings, and that would help you get some cover. We did that a lot. If you want to move for a better shot, you moved your figure, and then you could have a shot from somewhere else. The characterisation, in as much as remembering who the people were, was all based around what we were watching. So the characters were all Rowdy Yates, or, you know, famous villains, Billy the Kid. So it's only a tiny little development of characterisation, I know, but that's what we did. And I think, I don't want to go on for too long. I think this is about long enough for this video. But it's how we started our first dip into what became later a more formal characterisation. And the next step after this was changing the types of figures we were using into different scales. And at some point I'll talk about that. But for now, I'm going to say, aye, aye, yippee, yippee, aye. Ta-da, chook.